Hello once again, my friends. My name is Blaine the Brain, and you are listening to the Royal Ramble. And like most weeks, this one is pretty stacked. I mean, we're in WrestleMania season, so how could it not be? Needless to say, the next few episodes are going to be jam-packed, as there are plenty of big shows coming up and lots to talk about. In today's episode, I will be talking all about pro wrestling video games, from my own experience anyway. I should probably preface that discussion by letting you all know that contrary to popular belief, I'm not much of a gamer. I mean, I play them, I enjoy them, but unlike a lot of fans out there, it's not my religion. That is a joke, by the way, so I mean no offense. In any event, the newest WWE game 2K22 was just released this past week, and from what I've heard thus far, it's a lot better than the previous versions, despite all the alterations that likely had to have been made due to unforeseen circumstances such as, WWE roster cuts. So that is coming up shortly, and I also had a chance to speak with one of my longtime friends who happens to be a video game fanatic. In fact, he's covered plenty of gaming competitions and conventions. Arda Ocal will be joining me, and I'll play some of that interview later on. You may know him as Kyle Edwards in the WWE, but he was also a longtime host of Aftermath on The Score for all you Canadian listeners. Arda also participates in this week's personality profile, which I'll post up in the Facebook group a little later on as well. But for right now, I want to focus on some of the developing stories and highlights from the past week. The WWE announced that Big Van Vader will finally be joining the Hall of Fame on April 1st. He is universally recognized as the best, if not one of the best, big man in pro wrestling history. He was well before his time, and this is a huge honor for him. I couldn't be happier. It's about time. It's about Vader time. WWE superstar Ettore Ewan, better known as Big E, suffered a broken neck after a scary spot on Friday's SmackDown where he was dumped on his head after a belly-to-belly suplex gone wrong delivered by Ridge Holland on the arena floor. This is why WWE always throws up the disclaimer at the start of their shows, and I cannot stress enough to fans out there why you should never try this at home. It was last reported by my friends at Post Wrestling that Big E's injury will not require surgery. What that means at this point is anybody's guess as far as how much time he will miss, but unfortunately I think it's safe to assume that he will not be able to participate at this year's WrestleMania. Let's keep Big E in our thoughts and prayers and definitely wish him a speedy recovery. So those are probably the biggest two stories of the week, but then there's also the developing on-screen stories in the world of pro wrestling. We had two big events last weekend with AEW's Revolution pay-per-view and then Impact's Sacrifice on Saturday. Impact isn't a show that is discussed a lot on this podcast, but when I do bring it up, it means that I'm truly impressed, and I was with their Impact Plus special. I thought they did a good job overall in advancing storylines and continuing to develop some of their characters. I have to talk about the opening match between Trey Miguel and Jake Something. I've never been a fan of Jake, but he might have won me over with that performance. It was hands down his best match to date, and dare I say the best Impact or TNA match that I've seen in probably 10 years or more. It was that good in my opinion, truly captivating. What isn't captivating though, in my opinion, is the overall build for this year's WrestleMania. If I'm being honest, on paper it really does look like a decent card. And if I wasn't all that familiar with WWE storylines, I might be a little more interested. But as of now, there isn't a whole lot that they've done to really sell me on the event. Don't get me wrong, I'll be watching either way because let's face it, WrestleMania is still WrestleMania. But most of the matches really don't excite me. The two women's title matches should at least be good in the ring, but Becky vs. Bianca has been done a few times already since SummerSlam, and Rousey vs. Charlotte is not the match that people are clamoring to see. The money match is Rousey versus Becky. Becky is the one that beat Rousey to win the title. Becky's been the champion ever since, well, so she says, despite her pregnancy. So wouldn't it make more sense for Rousey to want to face the woman who took her title? There isn't really a hook for Rousey versus Charlotte. It feels so flat to me. I'm struggling to understand the motivation behind Rousey wanting that match. And then of course there are the celebrity matches. Look, I'm okay with celebrity involvement at WrestleMania. That's what the event was built on. But why does every celebrity used this year have to be in a match? Why not just like a guest ring announcer or corner person or something? It's mind-boggling, especially considering how some of these came together. Why would Logan Paul want a match with the Mysterios? The angle between Austin Theory and Pat McAfee is also a bit nonsensical and came together so randomly. Thing is, you have to care about the performer to make you care about the match. McAfee is not a JR or King from several years ago where you care about him getting beaten up. It doesn't have that same effect, although I'm sure they probably think it does. And I'm sorry, but no amount of piped-in crowd noise is going to generate much interest for me. It's the same with the SmackDown tag title situation. I mentioned in the Facebook group earlier about this match also being thrown together so randomly. Who did Boogs and Nakamura ever beat to earn this opportunity? I know they've been a unit for a while, but I can't remember them ever even having a tag team match. This is just a clear example of their desperate attempt to squeeze literally everyone onto the Mania card. The one celebrity angle that I am actually into is Zayn versus Knoxville, particularly because Zayn has been so great in this feud and basically everything he does. I really hope they give him a solid push coming out of this, whether he wins or more likely loses. AJ Styles versus Edge should be a great match as well, and one of the only matches on the card that I'm actually genuinely looking forward to. If done right, it could be another Angle versus Michaels. And then there is the big one announced earlier this week. The challenge was extended by Kevin Owens in the final segment of Raw to Stone Cold Steve Austin to appear on the KO show at Mania. I think it's best that Austin doesn't do anything too physical outside of maybe a stunner or two. He did accept the invitation on social media Tuesday, and that is something else that I'm actually looking forward to. My only issue is that the announcers keep talking about it and promoting it like it's an actual match, which I hope isn't the case. Steve Austin has been retired from in-ring competition for 19 years. Like I said, I don't think it's in his best interest to do anything physical. He's made a hell of a career for himself and doesn't need to do anything embarrassing or to tarnish that reputation. But I don't know what he's physically capable of. The only people who know for sure are Stone Cold and his doctor, so maybe we'll all be pleasantly surprised. And then that brings us to AEW. I spoke about the pay-per-view earlier, which was a great one, but one of the things that I really like about this company is that they always keep you guessing and they always keep you wanting more. I spoke with Dan Lavransky last week, who mentioned that it's great that the matches are so hard to predict because there isn't always a clear-cut winner. I was really impressed with the triple threat tag team match and almost shocked that they had the champs retain there, but you know, people often criticize the Young Bucks for their in-ring styles. Some think it isn't wrestling and that they no-sell everything and disregard the tag rules, but you know what? Their matches always still entertain me. And whether AEW wants to admit it or not, this is no longer a pro wrestling business, it's an entertainment business, and from that standpoint, the Bucks matches are great, similar to people being entertained by something like Cirque du Soleil. It's just a different style of wrestling that a lot of people, specifically the traditionalists, are used to. But the match of the night by far was the grueling battle between Jon Moxley and Bryan Danielson. Danielson continues to produce these 5-star bangers, and I don't think there's any question that this guy is the absolute best in the world, despite what CM Punk likes to claim, although Punk may be 1A. But with Moxley, I always kind of thought he was overrated. I've never really seen one of his matches aside from maybe his 6-mans as part of the Shield, where I was particularly blown away. But this is the match that did it. I thought it was fantastic from bell to bell. It felt like a real fight, and then the icing on the cake was the introduction of William Regal into the company. I loved how at the pay-per-view he didn't even have to say anything but was over huge, and then his promo on Wednesday was one of the best I've heard from him in years. It's really amazing what someone can do when they don't have a script to memorize. There were a couple of other surprises between Revolution and Dynamite, including Jeff Hardy and Shane Strickland being brought into the fold. I can kind of understand Hardy because he's such a big name and fans want to see the brothers team up for one last run. But with Strickland, I am a fan, but I don't think he's the big star that they presented him as last weekend. They made such a big deal out of his contract signing, but I don't really see how he's much different from anyone else they've signed recently. He's great in the ring, and I loved his match with Tony Nese on Rampage, but he's not someone that ever lit the world on fire. So I think they did make a bigger deal out of him than they should have, especially when his first match isn't even on their main show. So before switching gears to talk about gaming, I want to address the next big AEW pay-per-view event, Double or Nothing. Years ago when I had my blog, I would not only predict pay-per-view cards in full detail, but I would also fantasy book the next big card. So here's what I would do for Double or Nothing. They've already announced a rematch between Hangman Page and Adam Cole for Dynamite. I wouldn't rule out a title change in that match, but maybe they can do another non-finish or time limit draw or something so they can eventually revisit this feud down the road. Hangman Page's title defense at Double or Nothing is against the returning Kenny Omega in the rematch the world has been waiting for. Cole will be matched up against a guy who I don't believe he's ever faced, CM Punk. You've also got Jericho's new faction of 5 on one side of the ring taking on Eddie Kingston, PNP, and 2 partners who I'm thinking will be Sammy Guevara and Darby Allin for the traditional Double or Nothing Stadium Stampede match. MJF and Wardlow will continue to heat up and culminate with their first one-on-one match, probably for the TNT title. You've also got Keith Lee feuding with Team Taz, so I'm guessing a one-on-one match between himself and Powerhouse Hobbs may be in the works. The women's title rematch between Britt Baker and Thunder Rosa is upcoming, and I'm thinking that'll be the event that Rosa wins the title, and her first challenger for Double or Nothing is the rising star of Layla Hirsch. However, being that Britt is the top female wrestler in the company, and maybe the world, I wouldn't just keep her off the card. I'd book her a match for the TBS title versus Jade Cargill. But you know, heel versus heel doesn't do a lot for me, so let's add Mercedes in there and make it a 3-way. The tag team title situation is a tough one for me because there are a lot of teams to deal with, but I'm really impressed with the new team of Bryan Danielson and Jon Moxley, and I'll put them against the boy and his dinosaur, and they'll probably win the titles. You can easily also add another 2-on-2 tag match with Red Dragon against the Young Bucks, but I'd put 2 other teams in that match and make it an elimination bout to determine the next number 1 contenders for the following week's Dynamite, and those 2 teams would be the Hardy Brothers and FTR. Damn, this tag division is stacked. So with that, I'm going to switch gears and talk about my history as a pro wrestling video game junkie. It all started for me on my 5th birthday. I had just started watching wrestling a few months prior and was gifted a Nintendo Entertainment System the previous Christmas, so I was excited to see what kind of toys or games I'd get, and was hoping for a lot of wrestling stuff. I was not disappointed. My mom actually set up a kiddie pool in the backyard, which wasn't filled up with water, by the way, for anyone wondering, but it was just a little place that I could sit inside and open all my presents. My uncle, who was also a huge wrestling fan at the time, was a huge video game fanatic and bought me my first ever pro wrestling game. It was just called WrestleMania with Hulk Hogan on the cover. Let's just say that looking back, the cover artwork was much more exciting than the game itself. But I mean, it's Nintendo, and I was excited because it is still wrestling. The graphics were awful, as was the gameplay, but I liked that the wrestlers all had their theme music playing throughout the match. That was pretty cool. I was not a huge fan of WCW at the time. The characters and storylines were a little too mature for my liking, but my uncle also had this WCW game with the Road Warriors on the cover. This was my favorite at the time. The roster was much more stacked than the WWF game, and there was a much more extensive moveset. I remember when the screen would flash whenever a wrestler was about to hit their finishing move. It was awesome. And then this is the first wrestling game I remember where you had to advance through levels. Like you beat a jobber and then face a mid-card guy and then a main eventer and then the final boss, who was this masked man that I believe was supposed to be Vader. I had a lot of fun playing this one, and I knew more about WCW from playing this game than from watching it. I'd be like, oh hey, I remember that Steamboat guy. Arcades were huge when I was growing up. Nowadays, the gaming systems are so advanced that they aren't really needed, but back then, they had graphics that were out of this world. It was like PlayStation graphics at a time when only Atari existed. The downside was that I didn't have a lot of time to play. I was only about 6 at the time when I started learning about arcades, but of course I was always forced to shop with my parents. Usually when we made the trip from Toronto to Buffalo, they'd be shopping at the Galleria, and when we all sat down for lunch in the food court, my cousins and I would grab a bunch of quarters and swarm that arcade like our lives depended on it. And we'd often head straight for what I believe was the greatest arcade wrestling game ever made. It was called WrestleFest. The graphics looked amazing, and every character looked almost identical to how they appeared on television. Well, I mean, that's a stretch, but you get the picture. Oftentimes, when at the theater waiting for a movie to start, that was another opportune time to kill time at the arcade. There was another game that came out years later called WrestleMania the Arcade Game, where each character would throw a weapon as their finisher. It was so ridiculous and unrealistic, but still an exciting game. Like Bam Bam would throw flames, Doink would toss whoopee cushions, and someone on the board pointed out too that Shawn Michaels would drop the whole Heartbreak Hotel set on opponents. I don't remember that, but it sounds hilarious. I also picked up a few non-mainstream games as well throughout the years, including one that I got for Christmas one year called Tecmo Wrestling. I don't remember much about the game, but I recall there was a character who looked very similar to Tiger Mask, and the finishers were also ridiculous, kind of like a Marvel vs. Capcom combination sequence. It was great. My cousin also had a game for Super Nintendo that I loved called Saturday Night Slam Masters. It was the first game that I recall where you could do a tag match under tornado rules, so both of us could throw around opponents. It was a lot of fun. And then a buddy of mine had the Royal Rumble game for Sega Genesis. This is another one I don't remember much of, as we didn't play too often. I just remember you could beat up the referee, which we did quite frequently, and that Crush had bleach blonde hair, which was kind of weird. They couldn't just get auburn. I also had a Game Boy, for which I had Monday Night Raw. I played a lot on plane or car trips, but it would get boring very easily as it wasn't all that challenging to beat. The highlights of my pro wrestling video game playing journey didn't come until Nintendo 64 introduced their THQ sequence of games, starting with WCW vs. NWO World Tour, followed by Revenge 2 years later, and eventually WWF WrestleMania 2000 and No Mercy. Each game was almost better than the last. I love that multiple people could play the N64, so we had a lot of fun times back then. For me, in addition to graphics, gameplay and realism are of the utmost importance when it comes to pro wrestling video games, especially with me being a lifelong wrestling fan. No Mercy I loved because the gameplay was awesome. You could actually catch weapons being thrown at you and counter moves and all that. Plus, the story mode was so realistic. It was one of those choose-your-path type video games, so you would get a different challenge depending on if you won or lost a match. It was incredible. It didn't start this way for WWE though, because they had a really bad series of games before WrestleMania 2000 came out. I wasn't so much a fan of Warzone or Attitude. Warzone specifically was a major turnoff because of the limited roster, poor graphics, and cheesy gameplay. It was a difficult game to figure out, and didn't really excite me too much. Attitude was a little better. The graphics were amazing, but I still wasn't all that impressed with the gameplay or story mode. WCW had a couple of stinkers as well, including Nitro, Thunder, and later Mayhem, which was probably the worst wrestling video game of all time. The first SmackDown I recall was pretty bad as well. And in fact, the SmackDown games didn't really get good until the third or fourth installment. I kind of liked the Day of Reckoning games on GameCube when I first started playing, but nothing was ever as good as the THQ games, and there was a long period where I fell out of love with wrestling video games or video games in general. I thought I had outgrown that stage of my life, but it wasn't that. It was more that I just hadn't found the game that suited me. The WWE 2K series has been okay thus far, but I find with today's video games, they're a lot less of a challenge than the ones I remember. I am, however, looking forward to playing the new one. I haven't bought it yet, but it is on my radar. With that in mind, I want to play some of my interview with Arda Ocal. He's one of the wrestling expert friends I have who also happens to be a huge gamer. So let's take a listen. Okay, so the announcement was recently made about the newest WWE video game 2K22 being released on March 11th, and given your own connection to the video game universe and covering NHL gaming competitions, I'd like to talk about the history of pro wrestling video games. Firstly, were you always a gamer?
Yes, lifelong. Big fan. It was one of my first passions in life. I fell in love with the Nintendo. I fell in love with Super Mario. The Atari was actually my first system, and Yar's Revenge. Mm-hmm. And then graduated to the Nintendo. That's where I actually first started playing wrestling video games, but I really didn't truly fall in love with wrestling video games until I first played WrestleFest at the arcade. The NES games were okay. Mm-hmm. It was cool to see the wrestlers, the superstars that I watched on Saturday mornings in video game form, but the games just weren't there on the NES platform. It really wasn't until the 16-bit generation, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and the arcade in particular, that wrestling games really started to take off. And then when you get to the N64, 4 and No Mercy, WrestleMania 2000, the WCW releases, Revenge, etc.,
Mhm.
that's when you really kick it into high gear. So, yeah, to answer your question directly, lifelong gamer, still play a whole ton of video games today, and if I could find a WrestleFest cabinet that is pretty decently priced, I would buy it for my setup, because I have an arcade going in my house right now. It's basically like my midlife
Nice.
crisis. I'm not a car guy, Blaine. I go and buy arcade cabinets, and I have like 5 of them right now.
Nice.
And I need the wrestling ones to add to the collection.
When playing video games, or wrestling video games in particular, what kind of features do you look for in those kind of games?
Ease of controls definitely is one. I like when there's different option settings to be able to play the game very difficult and easy if you want. Kind of like a God of War kind of thing, you know what I mean? If I want to go story mode, let me go story mode. If I want to play it as difficult as possible and make it tough for me to be able to pull off finishing moves or whatever the case may be, then give me that too.
Mm-hmm.
I do love in-depth story modes and different types of modes. Like I like the creativity. Give me different ideas every year. That would be something that I would be into. Like one year, I get to create my own promotion from scratch. Mm-hmm. Another year, I get to, whatever the case may be. Like you can think of 1,000 ideas that you can put into a wrestling game. But I do like. I remember talking with the 2K guys back in the day, and remember being so impressed with how difficult it was to put together a game. And in particular, how much time they put into the creating lifelike looking hair. Like that was the feature that was the most difficult on the human body, was trying to replicate the hair, at least at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of think about it, right? Because like think about games from the 90s, everything looked like blocks, right? Wrestlers' hands looked like oven mitts, you know? And so fast forward and all of a sudden hair is waving back and forth, and it just looks really crisp. Mm-hmm. in many situations. The graphics do, and so yeah, those are the things I look forward to. And obviously, like when people are buying wrestling video games, they want to buy them because they want to play as their favorite wrestlers, or
right.
They want to hear the theme music and recreate the entrance, or they want to create their own wrestlers and face their favorite wrestlers and win the championship and go through story mode and career mode and whatever the case may be. But for me, like I just love, especially when I'm playing the retro games, it's a good dose of nostalgia. Like if I'm playing WrestleFest, it just takes me back to being a kid playing in the arcades and being in my happy place, Mm-hmm. And so those games in particular, or Raw on the SNES or whatever it is, those 16-bit games that were so much fun, King of the Ring, or WrestleMania, the arcade game. I absolutely loved that game. I loved how different it was. It was such a... And the best part is I've had a chance to talk with the developers of that game just to understand exactly why it was so different from other wrestling games, but then also why were there weapons in the game? Like what was it, like Shawn Michaels with a baseball bat, or like The Undertaker with a coffin, or
right.
Like the sequel had Owen Hart with a giant King of Hearts card, like stuff like that. It was just crazy. So like to hear those stories, I don't know. Like I guess for me, the big reason I play wrestling video games still is nostalgia, and that's why I probably gravitate towards the retro ones more than I do the current ones. But I do appreciate the current ones a lot because I know a lot of people who work on them, and I know how much of a task it is.
One of the things for me that I enjoyed playing involving the classic games, one of the big features for me is the unlockable characters. But now everything is, it seems like, downloadable. Like you can just buy those. Does that kind of take away from your enjoyment of the game?
No, not at all. I actually, obviously, the paradigm of video games has shifted, right? Like time was when you beat a game, you beat the game. Mm-hmm. Breath of the Wild, for example, is a perfect example of a game where, yeah, you can go and beat story mode, but then when you go and look at what percent you've completed the game, it's only at like 22%. So you have over 70% of the game to explore and discover even after you've beaten the story, right? Like that's where we've come to a point where, yeah, you can beat the game, but you have so much more to do after that.
Right.
So I love that personally, and honestly, like even old retro games like Battletoads is a great example. Like I love the reissuing of the games, let's say on Nintendo Switch Online or something to that effect, to play games that you never were able to beat as a kid, and then suddenly now you have a rewind feature or a autosave feature that you can finally be able to beat these games because they were so impossible back in the day, or there was some point in the game that if you found yourself in it, it was impossible to get out and you have to start all over again as a kid. And that was how frustrating was that, right? So,
of course.
Yeah, I'm totally cool with that. Now, here are some fun unlockable stories, especially from WrestleMania, the arcade game. So apparently, Mr. Perfect was supposed to be in that game.
Okay.
And apparently, he missed his flight getting in to record his motion capture. So he was scheduled to be in the game, and then he just didn't show up to do his motion capture, so they had to take him out of the game. Completely random story. And then apparently, I don't know if Adam Bomb is in the game, or if he was recorded to be in the game and then taken out last second, maybe because he left WWE or something to that effect. But Adam Bomb definitely had a mocap session and was with all of the Midway people, but he was never released as a character in the game, or maybe he is one of the secret characters, one of the two.
Now looking at the WWE 2K22, what have you thought about the promotion for the game thus far?
I haven't come across too much of it, maybe because I don't subscribe to the channels on social media that I would normally see that kind of promotion. Who's the cover athlete?
It's Rey Mysterio.
So that's an interesting choice, because I know that, like, with many video games, and the NHL series is no different, that cover athlete needs to be instantly, like, it needs to instantly grab your attention, and it needs to essentially drive sales, right? So when Rey Mysterio is chosen, they believe that Rey Mysterio being on the cover will lead to increased sales of that game. And Rey Mysterio will also be a fundamental part of the game. And which is great, and it makes sense because he is enjoying this resurgence. I feel like by the end of his career, we're going to see him as one of the greatest wrestlers of all time.
Oh, absolutely.
Whereas I don't know if, I don't think people necessarily put him in that conversation up until recently. And I'm not saying that as a disrespect. I think people were pointing to a lot of other people, but now that he's having this level of matches, these high level of matches at this point in his career, and his son is involved, and he's, contributing the way that he is. Here's Rey Mysterio once again on the cover of a WWE video game, when there's so many other talent. Like, you can put Brock Lesnar on the cover, you can put Ronda Rousey on the cover, you can put legacy wrestlers on the cover, you can put Becky Lynch, Sasha Banks, you could put so many people on the cover, but Rey Mysterio is the one that's chosen. Like, that says something to me, That is not a decision, that is not a hastily taken decision. So, I know this, like, because I've asked these questions to the people who make the decisions. Like, it is something that they think through and labor over for a very long time, So, to me, that is a great choice. And I think that Rey Mysterio holds a place in many longtime wrestling fans' hearts, that even if they're not a fan of the game series lately, they might give it a try simply because he's on the cover, and maybe there's something in the game that's him specific that they would want to play. So I think that's a good choice.
What would you like to see in the future of WWE video games? Any improvements that you would make based on recent games you played?
I would like to see them explore an esports ecosystem, to be honest. I think that the one thing is, I don't know if the game is esports ready, in the sense that one thing that is very important for an esports video game is that it has to be interesting to watch. And I don't know if the WWE video game as it exists today is interesting enough to watch as a spectator. And I don't mean playing the game, I mean watching it as a viewer. Now, if they get to that point and the game is fun enough to compete, I think that the fan base is rabid enough that it would actually support a WWE esports ecosystem. I remember a few years ago, they did a tournament, like WWE has done a lot of tournaments And I remember one final, I don't know if this has happened since. Maybe it was when I was still working there. I don't remember this exactly, but I remember there was a tournament final that happened at Barclays Center before one of the shows. And I thought that scene was really cool. So, I mean, look, Up Up Down Down is doing great content. I remember I started out doing content with Up Up Down Down when it first started back in, I think it was 2015. I was doing retro streams weekly with it. I was one of the first people to contribute to it. Obviously, Austin being the first. And so, I know that there's like a deep interest in gaming from WWE, and they have their own, I think it's called Superstar Showdown or whatever it is. And so there's definitely a gaming track there. So I guess more generally what I would like to see is the game get to a point where people enjoy, a whole lot of people enjoy creating content around it and competing in it such that an ecosystem can exist, because I think the wrestling fan would actually enjoy that if the game got to that point, which I think it could eventually.
So that concludes another week. Next week, I will be discussing any other developing stories and talking about the build for WrestleMania. I may even have a guest or two. Stay tuned. But for now, it's ABC.